Whether on the field, on the court, or on the balance beam, there's more to winning than the final score. Hi, I'm Patrick Manning of Black Desert Resort. We recognize the effort it takes to succeed. That's why we are proud to partner with Utah Checkdown, the podcast that tells you the story before the game, then gives you a recap of what happened when it's all over, the grit, the glory, and the disappointments. Join us for stories of Utah's finest athletes and coaches. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Once again, as always, happy to be back with you today to talk sports. So, getting at this a little later in the week than I was hoping. I wanted to get this really like Monday or Tuesday, but life gets in the way and it doesn't always work out that way. So we're here today on a Friday. I'm going to try to keep these more early in the week as best as I can, depending on how things go. Sometimes the basketball schedule, the media availability kind of mixes things up and makes it difficult, but we're going to try to keep that on schedule, we'll say. So before we talk about everything, let me tell you about our partners, Black Desert. At Black Desert Resort, you can truly indulge in luxury your way. Whether you choose a sleek studio or an expansive 4-bedroom suite, you're just moments away from teeing off on a championship golf course. Savoring top-tier dining, relaxing poolside, or exploring the rugged beauty of southern Utah. Whatever thrill you seek, it's right outside your door. Your journey awaits at blackdesertresort.com. Get lost and find luxury. All right, well, let's just jump into it today. We're going to talk Heisman title odds. Yes, it's January 24th, and we're going to talk about the Heisman. I know, sounds weird, but we're going to do it. Because you know what? FanDuel came out with their early odds, and look, I get it, right? Like, especially this early in the season. Are we even into what we can classify as early into the season? These things are just there for early content, let's be real. I mean, people can go out and bet on them right now. So, I mean, if you're a betting person and you like the odds of somebody, you could probably lock in some decent odds on some players. But, it is what it is, right? Like, we won't know really, truly Heisman contenders or people that are in that mix until, honestly, later in the season. Ashton Jeanty wasn't even in the mix last year, and he was a Heisman contender, right? At least he wasn't even being considered. And so when we have these conversations, I know people kind of get a little frustrated because there's nothing there. And so it's kind of interesting to see how it goes. But that doesn't stop the sports books from putting them out there. That doesn't stop us from wanting to talk about them. And that's just the nature of it, right? Like that's what we do. So we're going to talk about a little bit of the Heisman odds because what else do we have to do in January? So, like I said, FanDuel came out with their odds, and your top guys that are projected are pretty much all quarterbacks, as one would expect. This award, outside of this year, honestly, with Travis Hunter winning, it's always quarterbacks. It feels like, in some respects, it feels like it should always be renamed for a quarterback, but here we are. So your top guys are Garrett Nussmeier from LSU, Arch Manning at Texas. Nussmeier has an 8-1 odds. Manning has a 9-1 odds. Cade Klubnik from Clemson, 12-1 odds. And then your only non-quarterback in the top 5 is Jeremiah Smith at Ohio State at 12-1 odds. It honestly makes a ton of sense. Had a phenomenal freshman year as a wide receiver. Pivotal moment in that national championship game where he was on the receiving end of that long pass that allowed Ohio State to really maintain their lead and win the national championship over Notre Dame. So a lot of good things for him. Honestly, maybe one of the best players. Well, he is one of the best players in college football. I'm really curious to see what his progress is like into his sophomore year. Ohio State continues to find those guys, man. Like they churn out those wide receivers like nobody else, and so it's really fun to watch. And Jeremiah Smith, obviously, you can say early in the season, you can say late in the season. I have to imagine he's going to be in that mix easily. So, and then rounding out the top 5 is Drew Aller at Penn State, 13-1 odds. So those are your top 5. Nothing too shocking there, to be honest. I think that's a pretty standard list that you'll see pretty late. So, FanDuel didn't really have to stretch too far, right? So if you like those odds, go for it. Take them, whatever. The reason I'm talking Heisman title odds, though, is because Devon Dampier breaks the list. He comes in at number 34 with an 80-1 odds. So if you like those, that's some good odds that you can get some nice cash if you're the betting type. I'm not going to promote that necessarily. I know that's part of sports. I may or may not participate in that kind of stuff, but it's up to you. So obviously be responsible if you do that stuff. So yeah, Devon Dampier is ranked the 34th most likely to win the Heisman, which, take that for what it's worth, 80-1 odds. Good odds if you're a bettor, but as a quarterback, it's probably not too high. Just as a reference point, last year Cam Rising was 75-1 odds by an offshore betting site going into 2024. I didn't see what he was on a FanDuel, so I'm sure it was probably similar, right? And so Cam Rising, Devon Dampier are essentially in about the same spot in terms of where they're coming into in their progression. Now, I will say as part of that, Devon Dampier probably has the higher ceiling and potential to be in the Heisman title race than Cam Rising did. But you can see why Cam Rising was put in that mix simply because of his talent and his ability. Was never going to be, the most flashy quarterback or anything that way, but got the job done and was going to be able to help Utah. So, and maybe if he's there, you look at these players as kind of being instrumental to the success of their team, and you absolutely could argue that Cam Rising was that, right? You saw that when he went out, everything changed for Utah. So it was beyond that, but we've talked about that forever. So Devon Dampier is essentially starting at the same spot in that regard. Just kind of as a side note, Travis Hunter, as I said, who won the Heisman last year, early on in January. So those early January odds that they release, he was a 50-1 odds. Obviously, there was a lot of talk about him as a player and kind of his potential. But clearly it wasn't enough to be able to put him in the mix as kind of your top contender in Heisman. So take that for what it's worth, right? These are all just data points. They're not anything serious or anything like that. Players have to play this season, and they have to do what they do to be able to get in that conversation. And there's some players that go off, right? Like you look at Jaden Daniels when he won the Heisman. Like people expected a lot from him, and he was probably high in the rankings in terms of being in that mix. But all it takes is just having that extra special season, right, where things go off and you can be in that mix. Ashton Genty, right, like talented running back, but then has this remarkable season last year where he's in the mix, and many think that he should have won the Heisman. So it is what it is. It is kind of those conversations. The whole point of all this, well, before I get to that, let me tell you kind of the Big 12's top contenders, we'll say. I don't know where they're ranked in this. I could have counted, but I don't really care about that. Just looking at the odds and of the odds and who leads the conference in terms of the projections. Sam Levitt from ASU has 33-1 odds. Jalen Daniels at Kansas, 45-1 odds. Sawyer Robertson from Baylor at 60-1 odds. Avery Johnson, Kansas State at 75-1. Then it's Devon Dampier, so he's number 5 in the conference at 80-1. The next 3 is Jake Retzlaff at BYU, 120-1. Noah Fafita at 120-1. And Rocco Becht at Iowa State, 150-1. So those are your top, 8 quarterbacks that are leading in those Heisman odds. So really interesting to see how this season progresses. Sam Levitt, obviously, is going to get a lot of praise and respect for what he was able to do this year, leading Arizona State to the playoffs, and by all accounts seems to be in the mix to be able to be the leader of the Big 12 this next year. So what a crazy turn of events if that's what happens in July when those Big 12 media polls come out and ASU is picked to be number 1. It's clearly their on-field performance backed it up. They've done really well on the recruiting trail and in the transfer portal. So it's not that crazy, and you've got a great quarterback that is leading the charge. So anyways, enough with kind of telling who they are. So the whole point of these things, is more to look at the respect that you're getting, right? Obviously, FanDuel ties this to monetary value, so there's research involved with it, right? And so there's different things there, but at the same time, it's looking at where your program is, right? And if you're not getting in that mix, that's it's kind of a representation of kind of where your program's at. And so, yesterday I tweeted about this because I posted a story from John Wilner who made a case that Devon Dampier should be closer to John Mateer, the Oklahoma quarterback, transfer quarterback from Washington State. He has 25-1 odds as the 12th highest ranked player in these odds. And the two share very similar skill sets, right? And so Wilner made his case that Devon Dampier should be at or at least just right behind Mateer in these odds. That they're essentially, the same player. They have both the same opportunities, whatever it may be. So maybe that's something of the Oklahoma bias, SEC bias that some people talk about, or maybe it's just the nature of people seeing Devon Dampier not being as good as John Mateer. Who knows, right? They had very similar seasons. Dampier obviously led the fourth best offense, did it in the Mountain West, whereas John Mateer did it in the the Mountain West. So we'll see what happens there. But, the point being that this is about where people are projecting you as a program, right? And so, as I said, when I, excuse me, I'm sorry today. When Wilner wrote that story, I tweeted it out, just simple tweet, nothing. I got, some reactions that didn't necessarily surprise me, but kind of surprised me in the same vein. People getting frustrated by these early preseason stuff, right? And I get it, right? Like I'm right there with you. It's the beginning of the year. We're so far away from football. We literally just ended the last season, and that was crazy that it even went to January 20th. But it's easy to kind of get frustrated with that, right? But these top guys are the ones that are going to be there. So the frustration though is fans that they don't want to overhype this, right? You kind of get into this and you're like, well, we don't want to be out there talking about it. And look, like nobody's talking about a guy with 80-1 odds, right? You're not like necessarily hyping that up or doing that or saying like he's a legitimate, has a legitimate opportunity to the Heisman. Yeah, any player legitimately has an opportunity to it, but they have to produce it on the field, right? And so it is what it is. But the point here, in my opinion, is you want to be able to be optimistic about this, right? I think for so long, Kyle Whittingham has embraced this underdog mentality of, we're just going to kind of work underneath the radar and we're not going to do the things that are flashy. Like we're not going to take out billboards even when Tyler Huntley was kind of in that Heisman conversation, Utah kind of, this is my opinion, half-heartedly kind of put it out there and tried to get him involved in the mix late in the season. And admittedly, like he was behind the eight ball, right? Like they had, they were, it was too late for him to really kind of get it. But at the same time, not that he was in that mix anyway, because there was more deserving players that year. So that's more than just that. But it felt like a reluctance to be able to embrace this, right? To be able to talk about it. In the same vein of being able to hype it up. There's a lot of people that want to have these hushed tones. It's like before Utah was really in the mix for a championship, there was a lot of hushed tones of like, don't jinx it. And I get it. Like sports fandom takes on many forms, right? And, when I was growing up, I would wear a rubber band on my wrist because the last time I did that, I won this game, and I wouldn't take off this or whatever. Like we all get in these weird fixed patterns of, feeling like we're doing our part for the team. But like, to me, these hushed tones kind of hurt the program, right? And what I mean by that is, hype up these players, market them, right? Like be the ones that are out there pushing it. Now, you have to have some reasonable expectations here too, right? Like we're not going to go out there and we're not going to be like, oh yeah, we've got the best player in the country and he's ranked 80th in the country. Like, no, like nobody's doing that. You have to be reasonable. But at the same time, like if you're in the mix, hype these things up. And yeah, they do it on social media. But you've got to be able to embrace that, right? I don't know that we need, I'm not talking about us as a collective in terms of, fandom, but fans in general, hype up your program. Be excited for it. Do you think Ohio State goes around saying that, like, don't talk about the national championship? We want to get the no. And granted, like, look, they've been in the mix for years, right? But I think that's the next level of evolution for a fandom like Utah, or even a program like Utah. This is a combination, right? As I said, I think the fans have kind of taken on the mantra of Kyle Whittingham. But at the same time, expect it, right? That was the thing that Kyle Whittingham put on him the last few years, actually. And there was a change in that, where he talked about the expectations being championships, right? He expects to have a conference championship. He expects to be in that mix. Obviously, you can't expect to win it every year. I think, you want to be in that mix. But I think that's that next level, that next evolution of a program, where if Utah really wants to be taken seriously in this college football era, you've got to hype your program up. You've got to be in the conversation. And for all the frustrations that you have, whether that be in the Big 12 or you're not in the Power 2 or whatever that may be, the whole point is to be able to market yourself, right? And part of that is trying to hype up your best players. Now, once again, you've got to be reasonable. You've got to be able to look at this and say, is Devon Dampier or any other player on the roster, in that mix where, we should hype them up? Maybe not to the level where you're taking out definitely not to the level that you're taking out billboards or you're putting out these ads that kind of hype that up. But at the same time, do things to be able to put those expectations on your program. Do those things to provide expectations for your fans. And at the same time, yes, it has to back it up on the field. As we saw this last year, Utah was picked to win the Big 12. And I think there's no fan in, the Utah fan base that didn't expect that to happen, right? I think everybody, even maybe some of the more pessimistic guys, went into last season thinking that Utah has a legitimate shot of being able to be the Big 12 champions. And they did. I mean, quite honestly, they did. Their roster was good enough for it. Obviously, it doesn't look that way now with a 5-7 season, but sometimes things go wrong, as it did last year and the year before, and injuries kind of change things. Locker room dynamics change. A whole lot of things are there. Does that mean that Utah fans or the Utah program itself shouldn't live up to those expectations or have those high expectations? No. There's pressure there. I think the quote that you hear all the time is pressure is a privilege, right? And I think that is an opportunity. That means people care about you. Quite honestly, Utah's going to go into this season probably with not this. Well, I can pretty much guarantee that they're not going to have that same pressure. And that's an unfortunate thing for a program like Utah because they want to be in that mix, right? You want to be the one that is hated. You want to be the one that is at the top, where people are talking at you, where they want to give you their best games. You want to be in that conversation because it means somebody is talking about you. And for a program like Utah, that it's not a secret that Utah wants to be in a conference like the Big Ten, right? This isn't a secret. But at the same time, you don't get there by just staying under the radar. Utah doesn't get into the Pac-12 by staying under the radar. They had to be able to be on a national spotlight. They had to be able to move there. And so for those expectations, you've got to have them, right? You've got to be able to do it. And so whether it's the Heisman or whether it's a conference championship or playoff aspirations, whatever it may be, you've got to have that. You've got to be able to push forward into that. And, Utah has to be able to be in that conversation. So whether that means hyping up players, whether that means hyping up the program, you've got to embrace that, right? And yes, you have to be realistic, as I've mentioned, but you have to have that mentality. I think to some extent, you look at Ryan Day at Ohio State. The pressure was mounting tremendously for him, right? And there's a different kind of pressure at Ohio State than there are in many other programs. Maybe Alabama, some of these other places. There's other places in the SEC or in the Big 10 that have this high pressure. But Ohio State, probably more than any program in the country, believes that they should be a national champion every single year. And there's only a few programs that legitimately can make that claim and actually believe it. And obviously he hasn't been able to win some of these big games. Michigan has been a thorn in his side and it's really hurt him. And honestly, if they don't win this championship, I have to imagine that he is on the chopping block, right? And so you can see it. You can see the pressure building in him where he is, every little mistake is magnified and every little thing is done. I mean, the loss that they had to Oregon, every mistake was magnified, right? It was, Ryan Day can't do this. Why are they so stupid for this? And all this, the fans are upset. Then they lose to Michigan, and you'd think that it was a nuclear level, threat. And then they go on this epic run in the playoffs and are able to win the national championship, right? But I guarantee you, Ryan Day wouldn't trade any of that for what he was able to obtain. Now, obviously, he's in a different position than Kyle Whittingham is in for Utah. But they're not so different, right? Utah truly believes that they should be conference champions, which means that they should be in the playoffs, right? And if you're involved in the playoffs, if you're one of the 12 teams involved in the playoffs, you have a legitimate shot as a national champion. Now, look, Utah compared to Ohio State, depending on the year, is probably, maybe equal. Sometimes it's not. It's definitely not in terms of recruiting. But at the same time, if those are your aspirations, you've got to be able to play up to those. And instead, it's kind of these hush tones still. It's these, we don't want to be it. And yes, people may think you're brazen, and people may think that, you're being silly for having these expectations, but you're a fan. What expectations do you get if you're just going to have these hush tones about, I don't know, I don't know if we can get there, but I really want to have that happen. No, celebrate it, right? If you think your team is there, go for it. That's my opinion, right? And I think people get frustrated by that on Twitter, or it's like, oh, you're boasting and all you're doing is, once again, preseason hype. Sure, yeah, that's there. Obviously, the on-field stuff has to back it up, and that conversation gets louder if you actually do back it up. But I think that's the whole point of these types of things, these way too early top 25s or these preseason Heisman conversations. Yeah, they're all meaningless in the end, as you can see. Utah did not win the Big 12. They weren't even in the mix. Well, they were in the Big 12, in the Big 12 championship mix. That's what I'm trying to say. They were in the Big 12. Let's ask Mark Carlin. But neither here nor here. But the point being is embrace it, right? Embrace these types of things. Don't shy away from it and just be like, oh, stop touting these preseason stuff. Who cares? If your team is being favored in a preseason stuff, tout it. I'm not, look, don't get too crazy. I'm not going to tell you how to fan fully, but, embrace it. That's all I'm going to say. I'm going to leave it at that with the Heisman stuff because, it is what it is. Once again, I don't think you should be out there necessarily saying that Devon Dampier, 80-1 odds, he's going to win the Heisman. But I think that he has a skill set that absolutely could be there. As I mentioned on a previous podcast, he very much so has a similarity to a Jaden Daniels. Maybe not the exact same player, but in terms of the progression each year, if he can make that same progression, and it's easy to say, right? If anybody can make the progression that Jaden Daniels did, and now you're seeing that in the NFL, he's one step away from the Super Bowl. We're talking about a player that just clearly has been able to have success. But what I'm saying is he's following in the same path, right? Similar type of player, similar type of ability, similar opportunity, it can be there. And so whether he's in the mix for the Heisman this year or not, if he has a solid season, maybe he's, ranked higher next year. Maybe he's in the top 10. Maybe he's in the top 15, whatever it may be. But the point being is you want to be able to have this optimism, right? If he's able to lead Utah to the fourth best offense in the country, I guarantee you he's going to be at least close to that conversation. It's going to happen, right? And then you're looking at those preseason things as being like, oh, man, I wish I had him 80-1 odds. Once again, they're silly. We get it. But at the same time, it is a good conversation starter. It's a good opportunity to speak about your team. I'm sure BYU and Utah fans will have a little banter with it, whereas Devon Dampier is ranked higher than Jake Retzlaff. Say what you will about that. I'm not going to get into it. But that's what you're trying to do, right? As a fan, take every positive thing and tout it. And most fans do. I'm sure many that are listening to this, those are the types that do. But I think as a program and as a fan base, embrace it. That's all I'm going to say. So as part of that, though, with it being the national championship this week, we did have the final AP top 25. Utah obviously not in that mix. But, the top teams, Ohio State obviously comes out at number 1, Notre Dame number 2, Oregon 3, Texas 4, Penn State 5. Locally and in the Big 12, BYU finished at 13, Iowa State 15, Colorado 25. Kansas State received votes and TCU received votes. So interesting. Based on that, I don't honestly see a lot changing in that top 10 going into next year. Maybe Indiana doesn't crack that. I don't know. I'm curious to see how Indiana looks at that. as a top 25 voter, I obviously pay attention to this a lot more than most. But I think that top 5, especially Ohio State, Notre Dame, Oregon, Texas, Penn State, you can throw in Georgia right there in that number 6 spot. They're absolutely going to be in the mix to lead the next year. So, these are those the final poll. We are getting way too early polls. People looking at it, but there's still so much to kind of look into. These are those way too early ones. I feel like have lost even more relevance than they used to be, simply because of the transfer portal. We don't know a lot of what these players are going to do. Some of these players haven't even gone through spring camp yet and see how they acclimate with a team. There's guys that transfer in for spring and then they transfer out right after spring. So you may not even have some of those guys. Now, granted, most of these rosters stay the same from the guys that they brought in. But to me, I take more value in the mid-season projections for the top 25 and kind of where that is. And once again, these are projections. And as part of that, once again, these are what people think about your program. So if you're in that conversation for the top 25, clearly that means that they've got expectations for them that season, right? Honestly, Utah's not going to be in the top 25 mix next year in terms of the preseason stuff. They're going to have to work their way in. You start the season off with UCLA, and that in and of itself isn't necessarily going to get you in the top 25. But at the same time, there's not going to be these same expectations for Utah. And I think going back to that previous conversation, that's a shame for Utah, right? As a program, you want to be in that mix. You want to always be included in that preseason mix, or at least be in the conversation of a team that could be there. And yes, you could look at Utah's roster and you could say, oh yeah, they're on par with last year or whatever the case may be. And they probably are. I mean, I guess on par with a 5-7 season, you'd hope it's not that. But I'm meaning in terms of what the talent could have been. And so, you're looking at a team like Utah that's probably not going to be in that mix to start. And so there's going to have to be some groundwork made to be able to level up, right? You're going to have to go win UCLA. You've got Cal Poly. Nobody's going to care about that. You've got Wyoming. Nobody's necessarily going to care about that. Yes, it's in Laramie. But maybe if you start 3-0, you're going to start getting in that conversation, right? And I guess it depends on how you look in those games where Utah could potentially be in the top 25. It's easy to say right now that they won't be, after week 1, but who knows how these go. You could have a lot of teams lose, whatever that may be. The point here is Utah's not going to be in that mix, and so it's going to be a tough challenge for them. You're going to have other teams in that mix in the Big 12, and so you're going to have to work. But as I tell anybody that comments on my AP poll and is frustrated where I vote a certain team, it all shakes out in the end, right? These are just projections in time. It's a snippet in that week. And, you can argue a team should be 15 and they're 18. Yeah, I get it, right? Like I can go back and forth on a lot of different teams. I'll tell you, and a bunch of other AP voters will tell you, it's really easy to identify generally, the top few teams, right? They kind of stand apart. Some years it's like a clear breakaway 3. Some it's 5. This year was much harder, I would say, to try to identify that. Oregon made it easier because they just kept winning, and everybody else kept kind of losing and jumbling it up. But for the most part, there's a standard set of teams that are kind of always in that mix that are going to be at the top. Whether they fall 12 through 18, in my opinion, doesn't really matter because those are just numbers anyway. And to say that you're the 18th best team, and a team is the 12th best team, and neither one of them have played, and they're not in the same conference, it's all subjective anyway, right? And that's what, people get frustrated with these polls. But it's just a snippet in time. It's how your program is being looked at right now. A team, you could be ranked as the 5th best team in the country and still go lay an egg, and there you go, right? Like, clearly you weren't the 5th best team. But at the time, the trajectory and how you were was the 5th best team. So that's my little thing there. On top of this, kind of looking at those FanDuel odds, kind of projecting moving forward. And yeah, this is, we're projecting a lot for football. But they're out, and so I want to talk about them. The national championship odds for next year, as I mentioned, are going to be in those top 5 essentially. Ohio State 5-1, Texas 6.5-1. Those are always some weird odds. Oregon 6.5-1, Georgia 7-1, and Penn State 8.5-1. So. those are in the mix. As part of that, I kind of pulled the Big 12 stuff. And to me, look, national championship odds, as much as you want to complain about Heisman odds, the national championship odds are probably more diluted and less relevant in my opinion. But they still matter. And looking at those, the odds that they shake out, this is how the Big 12 would kind of, the preseason projections from the FanDuel odds would be. Arizona State would lead the conference. Behind them would be Iowa State, Baylor, Kansas State, Kansas, BYU, Utah, Colorado, and Texas Tech. Beyond that, the odds are much lower. But I mean, you're looking at that. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th place for Utah. And so if you like those odds, go ahead and take them. But you're looking at that where this is where you're going to kind of see Utah in the mix. Utah's probably going to be somewhere in the middle of a 16-team conference in terms of their preseason projections. Now, look, you've got to go through spring and you've got to look at how all these goes, and things can change. But these are those preseason looks. But I have a feeling that that's kind of where it's going to be, right? And I think that can be a good spot for Utah. But going back to that previous conversation, you want to be in that top upper echelon of the teams. You want to be the team that's talked about. You want to be the team that's hunted. And as much as, Utah fell on its face last year as being the hunted, I think other circumstances kind of made some of that possible. I don't necessarily think it was they didn't live up to their hype or expectations. It's just more circumstantial. And, we've talked about it. They recruited to one player, and when that one player was out, it changed the whole dynamic. You had an offensive system that didn't really necessarily work for the players on that team as you try to plug and play it. There's a lot of things that Utah learned from that it wasn't that Utah didn't live up to the hype in the terms of, they weren't good enough from that. They just had a comedy of errors, so to speak, that didn't. And maybe that's me making an excuse for them. I'm not trying to make an excuse for them. They really just didn't perform on the field. But at the same time, I think there's that level where, you have to hit it at the right time, right? Arizona State hit it at the right time. They had a great quarterback and they had a great running back. Obviously, they had other complementary parts, but you had two phenomenal pieces that were able to make the engine go. Cam Scatterbo, phenomenal asset. And so it worked for them. All it takes is, a couple of these players going off, and suddenly you're in that mix. And you have a team like Arizona State who, even though their roster really still isn't to the level that it needed to be to win a championship, ends up winning a championship, right? They got hot. They were able to play with consistency. I said this with BYU a ton as well. They were picked near the bottom as well, and they were played like a team that, was together, and they played well together. You could see the connections that they all had, and it worked. And so it changes on that kind of metric. So going into the season, Utah's going to be kind of in the middle of the mix. They're not going to be looked at last. They're not going to be looked at the top. And so Utah, has some room to grow, and there's still some expectations, but it's nowhere near the expectations that Utah had. And so depending on your opinion, maybe you are the type that thinks that they should be the underdog mentality and kind of do that every year. I don't know how you can have that mentality every single year and still win championships. So, take that for what it's worth. I think you're going to have to kind of figure out that. But interesting nonetheless, kind of looking at all these odds. What it means, nothing. Other than, market your team, be happy about it. I know going into this season, it'll be harder for Utah to kind of market that team just based on the production last year. But, I think this roster is put together in a way that has potential. Right. And last year I thought that their roster, had potential absolutely to be in the playoffs and maybe even win a playoff game. But, it has to translate onto the field. You have to see how things go. I think this roster, the way that they've compiled it, seems like it could gel really well. Obviously, you bring in a lot of new faces and your 50% roster turnover. But at the same time, I think they've done well to recruit to the offense that they want. They've done well to recruit to the defensive needs that they need. And so for as much as missing a bowl game sucks, and I know everybody talks about, you get extra practices for these younger players. In my opinion, it was always better for Utah to miss a bowl, especially with where they were, right? Like if you're in the mix, you want to get the bowl. But I think what happened is this allowed Utah to be able to fully reset over the offseason, as I've talked about. You get to hone in on what you wanted to do, whether that be offensive coordinator or the recruits. Utah locked itself in a building and essentially just did the work that it needed to be able to bring in the recruits that were going to help them succeed. We'll see how it translates, and we'll get some of that as a taste of spring, in a couple months. But they did well. So that's it for football right now. Let's transition a little bit to basketball. Obviously, last week Utah beat BYU in an overtime victory. Ezra Asar goes off and has this monstrous game. Had 26 points, only had 2 points in the first half. Really took over. We don't need to necessarily go over that one again, even though I think that game showed the potential that Utah can have. And maybe you're looking at two teams middling in the Big 12. I get that. But I think you see a team that showed its fight, right? And that's where Utah's really kind of been missing its pieces for the last little bit. They don't have that top-tier talent, right? Like, they're not Houston, and I'll get into that one in a second, but they're not Houston. They're not one of these upper echelon teams right now. They just don't have the talent to be able to be there. But at the same time, when this team wants to fight, they can be aggressive and they can contend with, I don't want to say any team in the Big 12, but many, right? We saw them contend with Iowa State for a while before they just kind of stopped and gave up, and Iowa State absolutely pulled away. And once again, Iowa State's a phenomenal team, and so that's going to happen. But I think you can take away from that BYU-Utah game that Utah has the ability to fight, right? And obviously they're going to play up to that game. It's at home. The crowd was raucous and full. But, you've got to be able to get this potential out of guys, right? Ezra Asar, he's talked about this, so this isn't something that I'm kind of blasting him with. He's talked about needing confidence and being able to just understand that he's the guy that can go out there and do that. You can stack these performances, right? If he can continue to stack those performances, that only goes to his confidence more, right? And then it allows him to unlock some of that potential that others see, right? You don't bring in a guy like Craig didn't bring in Ezra Asar thinking like, I'm going to have this guy that lacks potential or whatever. No, he saw potential and he's just trying to unlock it. And they have a great, bond. They have a great friendship and they've worked really hard to develop that and kind of unlock that with Ezra. And he's slowly starting to get there, right? And so you're starting to see it. And I wrote an article about it, and you can read about it. I posted it this week. But if he's able to do that, that really unlocks some potential for Utah. Lawson Lovering has unlocked some potential for himself that allows Utah to be able to be much more in the mix in the post, right? The last few years, outside of Brandon Carlson, Utah's really soft in the post. They didn't really have a huge inside presence, and so it was really reliant on guys making three-pointers. That's not quite the same this year. Utah's been much better in the post, whether that be with Lawson Lovering, who's really kind of unlocked a new level. Ezra Asar, obviously, if he's able to kind of stay in that mix and continue to be consistent and have that confidence, he's that next level. He's got some great ability down low. You've got Keanu Dawes. You've got some players that can be able to do it. And it's slowly starting to come together. They slowly are starting to believe in each other, but it's got to continue, right? And so you've got to be able to take that effort from the BYU game, the effort from the TCU game, the effort from the Oklahoma State game, a 3-game winning streak, and propel that forward to the next games. Unfortunately for Utah, they had to travel to Houston to be able to run into a buzzsaw, right? I mean, Houston's a team that just absolutely makes other teams look ridiculous. And they made Utah look ridiculous. They come out and win 70-36. They jumped out to something like a 26-5 lead or something like that. I don't have that one handy. But it just absolutely just decimated Utah. Their offense was clicking, but it wasn't even their offense that was kind of the highlight, in my opinion. It was their ability to just absolutely make their presence known on defense. They end up forcing Utah into 26 turnovers, which translated to 29 points for them. Utah shot 30%. They had no double-digit scores. They weren't aggressive. We talked to Craig Smith yesterday, and it was kind of like, Houston. The way that I equated is they went into this fight thinking, hey, we're going to go up against this top team. Then they instantly got punched in the mouth, and they shriveled, right? He said there was one of those things where they just kind of had this look on their face like they didn't know what was happening. In the sense like you lost. Like, my kids have played in competitive sports, and there's every once in a while this team that comes along and they're just clearly better, right? And you get that shellacking where they just wipe you up and down, and there's nothing you can do, and all you can do is say, please, sir, can I have some more? And that's kind of that moment, right? Where you just, no matter what you do or what you feel like you want to do, you just kind of give up. Your soul dies, so to speak. And so that's kind of how that game played out. Utah just had no answer. They weren't playing the connected form that they had. And admittedly, it was hard to get into that when you start pressing and you're starting to kind of think, we got to get into this. There was no getting into this. I mean, quite honestly, I had my story written 10 minutes into the game because Houston was just absolutely destroying Utah in every facet of the game. So now there's progress there. Craig sees some progress there in the sense that they were able to get a ton of offensive rebounds, much more than Houston ever allows. They were able to be aggressive down in the post in that regard. And so there's optimism there. But at the same time, to be able to have the Houston game right after, a 3-game winning streak where things are going to be confident building, that's a huge blow to the confidence, right? Now, it's one game. Guys get involved in this. Anybody that's played a basketball game has played teams like that. It happens. But I think the point is Craig is hoping that his team takes the lessons that they learned from Houston and tries to translate into this Baylor team that just kind of plays similar. They're clearly not the same as Houston, but they play similar. It's also similar to the play that Utah had against Baylor the first time this year. So, there's hope that when Baylor comes to town on Saturday, that they're able to have kind of more success. They're able to kind of get back to that, teamwork and everything. But it's not going to be easy, right? This conference is never going to make it easy. The games are at a much quicker rate. It's not your standard Pac-12 style where it was, Thursday you play your first game, then you play Saturday or Sunday. This is games, every 4 days or whatever the case may be, 4 days, 5 days, 3 days. In this case, because the game got pushed back a day for Houston. This is a tall challenge for Utah. And so, you've seen some optimism out of this team, and I think there's opportunities for them to finish better, obviously, than what they were projected. But this is a turning point for Utah, in my opinion. They were 0-3 to start conference play. They rallied, they played together, came together in a way that you saw that was completely different, right? They're working together and passing the ball. There's confidence. But this becomes another turning point in this season where Utah could just say, look, we're not clearly better than any of these teams, and we can't do it. And it's really easy to look at kind of who these teams are and say that Utah is just not in the mix. But, it's a challenge to kind of see this fight for the team, right? And so far they've answered the call. But we'll see in these last 14 or so games that Utah has what they can do. Let's be realistic. An NCAA tournament berth is not really on the table. It would take Utah running the rest of the schedule, which, is not really likely. And even on top of that, you'd still have to probably run the table at the Big 12 championship. But the point is, I know nobody wants to settle again for an NIT, and, it's tough. But I think you've got to be in that conversation. If you don't make the NIT this year, I think Utah's going to be in a full reset. And, whether you believe that's on Craig or whether you believe that's on the administration for their support of the program, whatever it may be, that's another disappointing season for Utah. And yes, NIT is disappointing. We get it. But I think you've got to be in that mix to show that there's progress. And if you can get to the NIT and try to get some of this holdover and bring some of these guys back, then there's a potential for you to be able to maybe make a run again. But if you're back to, okay, you made the NIT, but now you're losing all these guys again, there's no real hope. One of the reasons why Houston is as successful as it is they've kept the same guys. They're not outside of this year, they're not recruiting at this high level. They're in the top 50, right? I think the last few have been, top 40 or whatever it may be. But they're not recruiting at this level of a Duke or Kansas or whatever that may be, but they're finding ways to be able to have consistency. And so in the era of the transfer portal, they're still able to get guys to stay. And some of that comes with an investment in the program, right? Whether it be NIL or other means, it's an investment in the team. And this team does love each other. You're obviously going to lose Gabe and Mason, but you've got a team that believes in itself. If they can do that and you can add more athletic pieces and be able to do that, then that helps. But in this era of college basketball, if you're not able to get investment and support from, the athletic department or boosters, you're kind of toast. And so whether you like Craig Smith as a coach or whatever, it doesn't really matter if you're not able to get it. And it translates beyond Craig, right? Like, obviously coaches have to instill confidence and you have guys play for them. But even guys that love to play for a guy like Craig Smith, let's say, are going to go somewhere else because they can get more money if that's what it is, right? You've got to build this whole group effort of support from the athletic department, support from the coaching staff, and just a buy-in from the players, right? And that's tough, right? And so we'll see how this goes. But the reality is this is probably another season where Utah's probably going to be in the NIT if they are, and you have to see what happens after the season. So really interesting to see how that goes. I know it's been tough for running Utes fans the last 7, 8, whatever years it's been. And there's no real clear turning point. So we'll see what happens. On another side, the women's basketball team kind of was going for history in some respect the other day. Gianna Neepkins and Jenna Johnson were both on triple-double watch going into the second half. Gianna Neepkins had a more likely possibility to that. And so we were doing some research as media, and I was able to find that Utah's only had one player in history that has recorded a triple-double, which is kind of crazy to me considering some of the players that they had. In some respects, you would have thought Alyssa Peely could have been there the last 2 years. But Utah's only had one player in its history. And so a game that, was a blowout suddenly turned into really an interesting game to kind of see if they could do it. So Gianna Neepkins ends up with 30 points, 10 rebounds, and 8 assists. She almost would have had a 9th assist if Maddie Wilkie had hit a late three-pointer. I had asked Gavin Peterson if he would have kept Gianna in had she made that, if Maddie had made that three-pointer, and he said no, which kind of was, the look on Gianna's face was pretty priceless. She was pretty shocked. She understood it, right? Like, she understood the situation. You're up 20. There's no real need to chase stats. And he said that. He's not a stat chaser. He's looking at the game. He's looking at, how much they are up, all that kind of stuff. And he said he has some PTSD. I'm going to guess some of that is from Gianna last year where they were up big over BYU and suddenly she's in for the last second and, the rest is history for the season because she has a season-ending injury. So obviously she's the star of the team and you need to keep her healthy. One game against Kansas wasn't going to mean anything. Yes, it'd be cool to kind of etch your name in history and say that you're the second person ever to be able to get a triple-double in Utah history. But I don't think anybody's going to look at Gianna in any less light. She's obviously been great for the program, started as a freshman, has really kind of been one of the central figures into Utah's most recent turn to being successful, right? And being in the NCAA tournament mix and all that stuff. So Jenna Johnson, she was close as well. She had 13 points, 9 rebounds, and 7 assists. Obviously had a few more things that she needed to do, but remarkable effort from her as well. And then also in that game, Maya Torre, reached her 100th career block. She's another player similar to Ezra Assar, who, if she can tap into her full potential, I think you're going to see a really dynamic player. And you see it. There's games where she just completely goes off and becomes an absolute force in the game. And then others where she kind of gets lost. And not lost in the sense that she's not in the mix. Like, she's clearly in there doing her job and getting everything. But it's not to that same dynamic level. And I don't think Utah necessarily needs her to be. But I think you still need more consistency from her. And I think, as she gets to that, and I know Gavin Peterson continues to speak to that, this Utah team could be great. Because if she can continue to be a great inside presence, be able to be a threat down there, mix in Jenna Johnson, who herself has said that needs to be more in mixed, right? She's kind of been lost as well this year after having some pretty stellar seasons. If the two can be more dynamic in the post, that absolutely opens up Utah's game where they can translate that to those 3-point shots, right? And they're a team that when they're hot, they're going to hit those. And they're going to, hit them at a high rate, and teams are really going to suffer because of that, and make it difficult for them to kind of come back. So, curious to see how that goes. They play BYU this week in Provo, so they're going to have that rivalry game. On paper, Utah's the better team. This BYU team hasn't been great this year. They have Delaney Gibb, who's a phenomenal freshman. She continues to win Big 12 Freshman of the Week, and it's hands down the easiest vote, right? Like, I vote for the players of the week each week, and she's an easy vote. So, you've got to stop her. But outside of that, it's a team that isn't as competitive as Utah can be, right? Obviously, you're hoping you can get Kennedy McQueen back soon. If she can get back, that adds another dynamic asset for Utah. Brings Maddie Wilkie off the bench. It can unlock some more potential for Utah. So we'll see what happens. So, two basketball programs that are kind of in different directions right now. The women's team obviously has been doing really well. Still in the NCAA tournament title mix. Was ranked a couple weeks ago before some misfortunes. But they're still in that mix, right? Like, they're still kind of outside of the top 25 type team. Still have to have some more consistency, have to play better together as a team, but doing well. Whereas the Runnin' Utes, they're still kind of figuring themselves out. Things have clicked, but you're running up against a buzzsaw, right? You get Houston, now you get Baylor. This isn't going to be an easy task for them. So curious to see how that goes. But that's going to be it for me today. We're going to continue these podcasts, as I said, every week. I've laid out a plan for the rest of the year where we'll kind of lay out some of the football stuff. It'll still be pretty basketball heavy these next few weeks because we're in the middle of this season. But I'm going to try to have a new element every week about football. We'll go over position groups. We'll go over schedules, kind of like we did this last year where we break it down that way. So stay tuned. Hit me up if there's ever anything you want me to talk about or anything that way. I'm happy to chat about it. Hopefully get some guests this year and get some things going that way. So appreciate your time and listening to this podcast every week. And I will catch you again next week. Have a good one.